In the shadowed halls of Threadneedle Manor, a secluded English estate where the elite of the fashion world gather for a weekend of silken secrets, renowned seamstress Madame Eloise lies dead, stabbed through the heart with her own ornate scissors, threads of betrayal tangled around her lifeless form. Who among the circle of suspects could have woven this deadly design? The jealous rival designer, harboring a grudge over stolen patterns? The indebted nephew desperate for her fortune? Or the secretive lover, hiding an affair beneath layers of lies?
Chapter 1. The quiet threads of Thornfield Grange. Late summer sun hung low over the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the manicured lawns of Thornfield Grange. The estate, a sprawling Georgian manor, stood as a monument to refined taste, its ivy-clad walls whispering of old money and older secrets. Within its elegant drawing rooms, the air was thick with anticipation. For the annual gathering of the Ashburn family was no ordinary affair. It was a ritual of propriety, where polished manners concealed simmering tensions, and every smile was a carefully stitched seam hiding frayed edges. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair by the window, observed the scene with her usual quiet acuity. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically, a soft counterpoint to the hum of conversation. She had been invited to Thornfield Grange by her old friend, Lady Eleanor Ashburn, ostensibly to enjoy a week of genteel company. But Miss Marple, with her keen eye for human nature, suspected there was more to the invitation than mere hospitality. Lady Eleanor's letter had carried a faint undertone of unease, a thread of worry woven into its polite phrases. The drawing room was a study in contrasts. Lady Eleanor, a statuesque widow in her 60s, presided over the gathering with an air of weary authority. Her eldest son, Charles Ashburn, a barrister of some repute, lounged by the fireplace, his sharp features softened by a glass of sherry. His wife, Sylvia, a delicate woman with nervous hands, fussed over a tray of teacups, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting an unwelcome guest. Their daughter, Clara, a bright-eyed girl of 20, sat at the pianoforte, her fingers hesitating, over a melancholy tune. Across the room, the younger Ashburn's son, Lionel, stood apart, his dark eyes brooding as he stared out at the gardens. His fiancée, Beatrice Lyle, a seamstress of remarkable talent, hovered near him, her auburn hair catching the light as she adjusted the lace cuffs of her modest dress. Beatrice was an outsider in this world of inherited wealth, her presence a quiet challenge to the Ashburn lineage. Miss Marple noted the way Lionel's hand lingered on Beatrice's arm, a gesture both protective and possessive. The final members of the party were Dr. Rupert Haworth, the family physician, and Mrs. Lavinia Gray, a distant cousin with a penchant for gossip. Dr. Haworth, a stout man with a jovial demeanor, was regaling Mrs. Gray with a tale of his latest medical triumph, though his eyes frequently strayed to Beatrice with an intensity that Miss Marple found curious. Mrs. Gray, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of chatter, her sharp tongue slicing through the room's decorum like a poorly wielded needle. The clock on the mantel struck 6, its chimes cutting through the polite murmur. Lady Eleanor rose, her silk gown rustling. "Shall we adjourn to the dining room?" she asked, her voice betraying a faint tremor. The party began to move, but Miss Marple remained seated, her needles pausing as she caught a fleeting glance between Charles and Sylvia, look of shared apprehension. Dinner was a formal affair, the long mahogany table gleaming under candlelight. The conversation turned to trivial matters: the weather, the upcoming village fete, the quality of the season's harvest. Yet Miss Marple's sharp ears caught the undercurrents, the way Charles avoided mentioning his latest case, the way Sylvia's laugh was too brittle The way Lionel's responses to Beatrice were clipped and guarded. Dr. Hayworth, seated beside Beatrice, was overly attentive, commenting on the exquisite embroidery of her napkin, a piece she had crafted herself. Beatrice smiled politely, but her fingers tightened around her fork. As the dessert course was served, a delicate lemon souffle, Mrs. Gray leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with mischief. Beatrice, my dear, you must tell us about your latest commission. I hear you're designing a gown for the Duchess of Claremont. Quite a coup for a village seamstress. Beatrice flushed, her composure faltering. It's merely a small project, she murmured. The Duchess was kind enough to notice my work. Nonsense, Dr. Hayworth interjected, his voice hearty. Your skill with a needle is unmatched. Miss Lyle, why, I'd wager you could stitch a secret into every seam, and no one would be the wiser. The table fell silent, the remark hanging in the air like a dropped stitch. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, noting the way Beatrice's hand trembled as she reached for her glass. Lionel's jaw tightened, and Sylvia's teacup clattered against its saucer. The moment passed, and conversation resumed. But Miss Marple's mind was already at work. She observed the way each guest interacted, the subtle gestures that betrayed their thoughts. Charles's frequent glances at his watch suggested impatience, perhaps a pressing engagement elsewhere. Sylvia's nervous habit of twisting her wedding ring hinted at unease. And poor Beatrice seemed to carry a weight far heavier than her delicate frame suggested. As the party retired to the drawing room for coffee, Miss Marple lingered at the table, her knitting abandoned in her lap. She studied the room, her gaze settling on a small sewing basket tucked beneath Beatrice's chair. It was a simple thing, wicker and worn, but its presence struck her as significant. Why had Beatrice brought it to dinner? And why had she clutched it so tightly when Dr. Hayworth mentioned secrets? The evening drew to a close, and the guests dispersed to their rooms. Miss Marple, however, remained in the drawing room, her mind threading together the fragments of the day. She knew, with the certainty of long experience, that Thornfield Grange was a tapestry of secrets, and one of those threads was about to unravel as she climbed the grand staircase to her guest room. The house settled into an uneasy silence. The clock struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the darkened halls. Miss Marple paused, her hand on the banister, her thoughts sharp and clear. Somewhere in this house, she sensed, a crime was waiting to be discovered, a crime that would require all her little gray cells to unravel. Chapter 2. A thread snapped. The morning dawned gray and heavy over Thornfield Grange, the sky a quilt of clouds that promised rain. The household stirred slowly, the clink of breakfast china mingling with the distant rumble of thunder. Miss Jane Marple, already dressed in her neat tweed skirt and cardigan, sat at the breakfast table, her sharp eyes scanning the room over the rim of her teacup. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, as if the guests sensed a storm beyond the one brewing outside. Lady Eleanor presided over the meal with her usual dignity, though her face was pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. Charles Ashburn was absent, his place at the table conspicuously empty. Sylvia, his wife, offered a strained explanation about an early morning walk, but her eyes darted nervously to the door. Clara, their daughter, picked at her toast, her youthful exuberance dimmed by an uncharacteristic silence. Lionel and Beatrice sat close together, their heads bent in quiet conversation, while Dr. Rupert Hayworth and Mrs. Lavinia Gray exchanged banal pleasantries about the weather. Miss Marple noted it all, the absences, the silences, the forced cheer. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, a silent companion to her observations. She was about to comment on the quality of the marmalade when a piercing scream shattered the morning calm. The sound came from the direction of the east wing, where the guest rooms were located. Lady Eleanor froze, her teacup clattering against its saucer. Lionel leapt to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor, and Beatrice's hand flew to her mouth. Without a word, the party rushed toward the source of the cry. Miss Marple following at a measured pace, her calm demeanor belying the quickening of her pulse. They found Clara standing in the corridor outside Beatrice's room, her face ashen, her hands clutching the doorframe. "It's Beatrice," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She's dead." The word hung in the air like a dropped needle, sharp and final. Lionel pushed past Clara, his face a mask of dread, and entered the room. The others followed, save for Miss Marple, who paused at the threshold, her eyes sweeping the scene with meticulous care. Beatrice Lyle lay on the floor beside her bed, her auburn hair fanned out like a halo. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, and a dark stain spread across the bodice of her nightgown. A pair of sewing scissors, their blades gleaming wickedly, protruded from her chest. The room was otherwise undisturbed, no overturned furniture, no signs of a struggle. The sewing basket Miss Marple had noticed the previous evening sat on a side table, its lid slightly ajar, revealing a tangle of threads and needles. Lionel dropped to his knees beside Beatrice, a choked sob escaping his lips. No, it can't be," he murmured, reaching for her hand, which lay limp and cold. Dr. Hayworth, ever the professional, knelt beside her, checking for a pulse he knew he would not find. "She's gone," he confirmed, his voice heavy, stabbed through the heart. Death would have been instantaneous. Lady Eleanor swayed, clutching Sylvia's arm for support. "Who could have done this?" she whispered. "In my house, under my roof." Mrs. Gray, her gossiping nature momentarily subdued, crossed herself and muttered something about the devil's work. Clara, still trembling, clung to her mother, tears streaming down her face. Miss Marple, however, remained at the doorway, her gaze moving from the body to the room's details: the open window, the neatly made bed, the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. "Someone must call the police," Sylvia said, her voice brittle. And we mustn't touch anything." "Quite right," Miss Marple said softly, stepping into the room at last. Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, taking in every detail. "The police will need to see everything exactly as it is. But perhaps, Dr. Hayworth, you could confirm the time of death." The doctor nodded, his face grim. "Rigor mortis has just begun to set in. I'd estimate she died between midnight and 2 o'clock this morning." Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. She glanced at the sewing basket, noting a single spool of crimson thread that seemed out of place among the muted colors. "And the scissors," she mused aloud, almost to herself. "They are hers, I presume." Lionel looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "Yes," he said hoarsely. "She always kept them close. They were her favorite pair, engraved with her initials." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, but she said nothing more. The group stood in stunned silence until the sound of footsteps announced the arrival of Charles, his coat damp from the rain that had begun to fall. He froze at the sight of Beatrice's body, his face draining of color. "Good God," he muttered. "What's happened?" Sylvia rushed to him, her words tumbling out in a frantic whisper. As the family began to murmur among themselves, Miss Marple slipped away, her mind already threading together the fragments of the scene. She returned to the dining room, where the breakfast things still lay abandoned, and sat quietly, her knitting resumed, but her needles moved slowly, her thoughts racing. Beatrice Lyle, the seamstress who had stitched her way into the Ashburn family, was dead. The scissors, her own, had been turned against her. The room bore no signs of a struggle, suggesting the killer had been someone she knew, someone she trusted, and the time of death, midnight to 2 o'clock, placed the crime in the heart of the night, when the house was silent and its occupants supposedly asleep. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she recalled the previous evening, the strained glances, the guarded words, the sewing basket that Beatrice had clutched so tightly. She thought of Dr. Hayworth's odd remark about secrets in seams, of Lionel's protective demeanor, of Sylvia's nervous fidgeting. Each was a thread, and together they formed a pattern she could not yet fully discern. The police would arrive soon, no doubt, with their questions and their notebooks. But Miss Marple knew that the truth lay not in the obvious but in the subtle, in the contradictions, the hesitations, the details that others overlooked. She would watch, and she would listen, and she would let her little gray cells work their quiet magic. As the rain began to patter against the windows, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles clicking softly. The tapestry of Thornfield Grange had been torn, and it was up to her to mend it, stitch by careful stitch.
Chapter 3. The Arrival of Order. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle by the time the police arrived at Thornfield Grange, their motor car crunching along the gravel drive with an air of grim purpose. Inspector Japp, a stocky man with a bristling mustache and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped out, followed by a young constable clutching a notebook. The household, still reeling from the discovery of Beatrice Lyle's body, gathered in the drawing room, their faces a patchwork of shock, grief, and guarded suspicion. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her corner, her knitting needles moving with deliberate calm, her eyes missing nothing. Lady Eleanor, pale but composed, greeted the inspector with a nod. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Inspector," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "This is a dreadful business." "Indeed, Lady Ashbourne," Japp replied, his tone brisk but not unkind. "I'll need to see the scene at once, and then I'll speak with each of you. No one is to leave the house until we've got to the bottom of this." As Japp and the constable made their way to the east wing, Miss Marple observed the reactions of the gathered party. Lionel sat slumped in an armchair, his face buried in his hands, the picture of a man broken by grief. Sylvia, standing by the window, twisted her wedding ring with such ferocity that Miss Marple feared she might draw blood. Charles, who had returned from his mysterious morning walk, stood by the fireplace, his expression unreadable but his posture rigid. Clara clung to her mother, her eyes red from crying, while Dr. Hayworth busied himself with a glass of brandy, his jovial mask replaced by a strained silence. Mrs. Gray, ever the opportunist, hovered near the door, her ears straining for any snippet of news. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the timing of the inspector's arrival. It was not Japp's presence that intrigued her, but the fact that she herself had not been summoned to Thornfield Grange by chance. Lady Eleanor's letter, with its subtle undertone of unease, had hinted at trouble brewing. Had she foreseen this tragedy, or was there another thread in this tapestry that Miss Marple had yet to unravel? The inspector returned, his face grim. "Miss Lyle was stabbed with her own sewing scissors," he announced, addressing the room. "Death occurred between midnight and 2 o'clock, according to Dr. Hayworth's initial assessment. The room shows no signs of a struggle, which suggests the killer was someone she knew. I'll need statements from everyone, starting with where you were during those hours." A murmur rippled through the group, but no one spoke. Japp's eyes narrowed, and he turned to Lady Eleanor. "Perhaps we could use the library for interviews. It's private, and I'll need to speak with each of you alone." "Of course," Lady Eleanor replied, leading the way. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple rose, her movements unhurried. She approached Jap, her expression one of polite concern. "Inspector, might I have a word? I was a guest here last night, and I may have observed a detail or two that could be of use." Jap's mustache twitched, a sign of his grudging respect for the elderly spinster who had, on more than one occasion, outwitted him with her little gray cells. "Very well, Miss Marple," he said, "but let's keep this quick. I've got a murder to solve." They stepped into the library, a grand room lined with leather-bound volumes and heavy oak furniture. Jap sat behind the desk, his notebook open, while Miss Marple took a chair opposite, her knitting resting in her lap like a trusted confidant. "I understand you were at dinner with the family last night," Jap began. "Did anything strike you as unusual?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her expression remained demure. "People are rarely what they seem, Inspector, especially in a house like this. I noticed a certain tension at dinner. Small things, you understand. The way Mr. Charles Ashbourne checked his watch repeatedly, as if he had an appointment he could not miss. The way Mrs. Sylvia Ashbourne twisted her ring, a nervous habit that suggests unease, and Miss Beatrice Lyle." She paused, her needles clicking softly. She seemed preoccupied, clutching her sewing basket as if it were a shield. Jap scribbled a note, his brow furrowing. "And this basket, anything significant about it?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "It was wicker, well worn, with a spool of crimson thread that stood out among the others. I found it curious that she brought it to dinner, as if she could not bear to be parted from it." Jap grunted, clearly unimpressed by what he considered trivial. "Anything else?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice soft but precise. "Dr. Hayworth made a peculiar remark about secrets stitched into seams. It was said in jest, but it unsettled Miss Lyle, and Mr. Lionel Ashbourne was protective of her, almost to the point of possessiveness. These are small 3A. Chapter 4. The questions begin. The library. At Thornfield Grange, with its towering bookshelves and the faint scent of old leather, became a confessional of sorts as Inspector Jap conducted his interviews. The rain continued to drum against the windows, a relentless rhythm that seemed to underscore the growing unease within the house. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a corner of the drawing room, listened to the comings and goings with her characteristic quiet attentiveness, her knitting needles moving in a steady, almost meditative cadence. To an outsider, she might have appeared a harmless old spinster, absorbed in her wool, but her mind was stitching together the threads of suspicion that hung heavy in the air. Inspector Jap emerged from the library, his notebook bulging with hastily scribbled notes. He had spoken to each member of the household, and now his attention turned to the physical evidence. "Miss Marple," he said, catching sight of her, "you've got a knack for noticing things. Care to join me for a look at the scene again? I could use a second pair of eyes." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression one of mild surprise, though her eyes gleamed with interest. "I am happy to assist, Inspector," she said, rising with a grace that belied her years, "though I suspect the truth lies as much in what people say as in what they leave behind." They made their way to Beatrice Lyle's room, where the constable stood guard, his youthful face pale but resolute. The scene was much as it had been that morning. Beatrice's body had been removed, but the bloodstain on the rug remained, a dark accusation against the room's otherwise pristine order. The sewing scissors, now bagged as evidence, had been replaced by a chalk outline on the floor. The open window let in a damp breeze, and the sewing basket still sat on the side table, its lid askew. Jap paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "No signs of forced entry," he muttered. "The window was open, but the ground outside is too soft from the rain to hold footprints. The scissors were hers, no question. But why use them? And why no struggle?" Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the sewing basket. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the wicker edge. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the basket. Jap nodded, and she carefully lifted the lid, revealing a jumble of threads, needles, and thimbles. The spool of crimson thread caught her eye again, its vivid hue standing out against the muted greens and blues. She picked it up, noting its weight, slightly heavier than expected for a spool of its size. "Curious," she murmured, turning it over in her hands. "This thread is not like the others. It's silk, finer than the rest, and the spool feels unusual." Jap raised an eyebrow. "Unusual how?" Miss Marple hesitated, her fingers probing the spool's base. With a gentle twist, it came apart, revealing a small, hollow compartment. Inside was a folded piece of paper, no larger than a postage stamp. She unfolded it carefully, her movements precise, and read the words scrawled in a hurried hand. "Meet me at midnight. The truth must out." Jap's eyes widened. "Good Lord, Miss Marple, what's this?" "A clue, Inspector," she said softly, handing him the paper. "And a dangerous one, I fear. Beatrice was meeting someone last night, someone who knew her secrets, or wished to expose them." Jap pocketed the note, his face a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "You've got a nose for this, I'll give you that. But let's not jump to conclusions. We need to know who wrote this and why." They returned to the drawing room, where the household awaited, their faces a gallery of strained expressions. Jap held up the note, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "This was found in Miss Lyle's sewing basket. It's a message arranging a meeting at midnight, the time of her death. I want to know who wrote it, and I want to know now." A ripple of unease passed through the group. Lionel's head snapped up, his eyes blazing. "That's impossible," he said hoarsely. "Beatrice would have told me if she was meeting someone." "Would she?" Jap asked, his tone sharp. "You were out walking until midnight, Mr. Ashbourne. Where exactly were you?" Lionel flushed, his hands clenching. "I was in the gardens, as I said. I couldn't sleep. I didn't see Beatrice after dinner." Jap turned to Sylvia, who was twisting her ring with renewed vigor. "Mrs. Ashbourne, you mentioned a headache. Did you hear anything unusual last night? A cry, perhaps, or footsteps?" Sylvia's eyes darted to her husband before she answered. "No, Inspector. I took a sleeping draught and was out by 10. I heard nothing." Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in Sylvia's voice, the way her gaze flickered to Charles. She made a mental note of it, along with the fact that Charles's study was just down the hall from Beatrice's room. "And you, Mr. Ashbourne?" she asked gently, her tone deceptively mild. "You were working late in the study. Did you notice any movement in the east wing?" Charles's jaw tightened, but he met her gaze steadily. "I was focused on my papers, Miss Marple. I heard nothing out of the ordinary." Dr. Hayworth, who had been uncharacteristically silent, cleared his throat. "If I may, Inspector, the east wing is quite isolated. A cry might not have carried far, especially with the rain." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you, Doctor? You were in the billiard room, I believe. Did you happen to pass by the east wing on your way to bed?" Hayworth's jovial demeanor faltered for a moment. No. I took the main staircase. I retired around 1, and all was quiet." Mrs. Gray, eager to contribute, leaned forward. "I was asleep by 10, as I said, but I did hear a door creak around midnight. I thought it was just the house settling, but now I wonder." Jap scribbled furiously, his frustration evident. "Right. We'll need to verify these alibis. and I'll have that note analyzed for handwriting. In the meantime, no one leaves the estate." As Jap continued his questions, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her knitting resumed. The note was a significant find, but it raised more questions than it answered. Who had Beatrice planned to meet? And why had she hidden the note in such a clever place? The crimson thread, too, nagged at her. It was not just a clue, but a symbol, a bold stroke in a tapestry of deception. She thought back to the dinner, to Dr. Hayworth's odd remark about secrets and seams. Had he known something about Beatrice's habits, or was it a careless jest? Lionel's grief seemed genuine, but his late-night walk was suspiciously timed, and Sylvia's nervous demeanor suggested she was hiding more than a headache. Each suspect was a thread, and Miss Marple knew that pulling the right one would unravel the entire mystery. As the rain intensified outside, Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind weaving a pattern from the scattered clues. The truth was there, hidden in the folds of Thornfield Grange, and she would find it, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The afternoon at Thornfield Grange was cloaked in a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house and the distant clatter of the police as they continued their investigation. Inspector Japp, fortified by a strong cup of tea, had taken to pacing the drawing room, his notebook now a chaotic jumble of alibis, contradictions, and unanswered questions. The household, confined to the estate by his orders, moved about like figures in a somber tableau, their faces etched with varying degrees of guilt, fear, and suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the window with her knitting, observed them all, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm that belied the rapid workings of her mind. Japp's investigation had taken a sharp turn toward Lionel Ashbourne, whose grief-stricken demeanor and late-night walk made him an easy target. The inspector had discovered a crumpled letter in Lionel's room, written in Beatrice's hand, which hinted at a quarrel between them. The letter, dated 2 days prior, read, "Lionel, we cannot go on like this. Your jealousy is tearing us apart. I must have my freedom." Japp, waving the letter like a flag of triumph, had declared it a motive for murder. "He was out walking at the time of the crime," Japp announced to the assembled group, his voice carrying an air of finality. "And this letter suggests he had reason to want her silenced." Lionel, his face pale and his eyes hollow, protested vehemently. "I loved Beatrice," he cried, his voice breaking. "I would never harm her. That letter, it was a misunderstanding. We argued, yes, but it was about her work, her long hours with clients. I was worried for her, not jealous." The room buzzed with murmurs. Sylvia, clutching Clara's hand, cast a wary glance at her brother-in-law, while Charles's lips tightened into a thin line. Dr. Hayworth, standing by the fireplace, shook his head as if in pity, though Miss Marple noted the way his fingers gripped his glass a little too tightly. Mrs. Gray, never one to miss an opportunity, leaned forward, her voice dripping with insinuation. "Jealousy is a powerful motive, Inspector. I've heard whispers in the village about Lionel's temper." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. She had seen this before. The rush to judgment, the eagerness to pin the crime on the most obvious suspect. Lionel's letter was damning, yes, but it was too convenient, too neatly placed to be the whole truth. She thought of the crimson thread in Beatrice's sewing basket, the hidden note that spoke of a midnight meeting. These were not the actions of a woman planning to flee a jealous lover, but of one guarding a secret worth dying for. As Japp pressed Lionel for details of his walk, where exactly he had gone, whether anyone had seen him, Miss Marple's attention shifted to the others. Sylvia's nervous habit of twisting her ring had intensified, her fingers working it like a rosary. Charles, who had been silent during much of the discussion, seemed overly focused on adjusting his cufflinks, a gesture that struck Miss Marple as a shield against scrutiny. Clara, meanwhile, had retreated into herself, her eyes fixed on the floor as if avoiding the accusations swirling around her uncle. Dr. Hayworth, sensing the tension, attempted to lighten the mood. "Come now, Inspector," he said with forced joviality. "Lionel's a passionate chap, but murder? Surely we're looking for someone with a colder heart. Beatrice was well liked, after all." "Was she?" Miss Marple interjected softly, her voice cutting through the room like a finely threaded needle. All eyes turned to her, and she continued, her tone gentle but probing. "I wonder, Dr. Hayworth, if you could tell us more about Miss Lyle's clients. You seemed quite admiring of her work at dinner last night. Did you know any of them personally?" The doctor blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Well, I knew of her reputation, of course. She was talented, as I said. The Duchess of Claremont, for one, was quite taken with her designs." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. "And did you ever visit her at her shop in the village? Perhaps to discuss her work, or other matters?" Hayworth's smile faltered, and a flush crept up his neck. "I may have stopped by once or twice, as a friend of the family, nothing more." Jap, sensing a new lead, scribbled a note. "Right. I'll want a list of her clients. Anyone she might have crossed. Anyone with a grudge." Miss Marple returned to her knitting, but her mind was far from idle. Dr. Hayworth's discomfort was telling, as was his quick deflection. She recalled his remark about secrets and seams, a comment that had seemed playful at the time but now carried a darker weight. And then there was Sylvia, whose nervous demeanor suggested she knew more than she was letting on. The letter in Lionel's room was a red herring, Miss Marple was certain, designed to draw attention away from the true killer. But who had placed it there, and why? As the afternoon wore on, Jap's focus remained on Lionel, whom he now considered the prime suspect. He ordered the constable to search Lionel's belongings again, and the young man was led away, his protests echoing down the hall. The others dispersed, their alibis reaffirmed but their secrets unexposed. Miss Marple, however, lingered in the drawing room, her eyes drifting to the window where the rain had left a pattern of streaks, like tears on a grieving face. She thought of Beatrice, the seamstress whose skill had won her both admiration and envy. The note hidden in the crimson spool suggested a clandestine meeting, but with whom? And why had the killer chosen her own scissors as the weapon? It was a deliberate act, Miss Marple felt, a message stitched into the very fabric of the crime. As the clock struck 4, Lady Eleanor entered, her face drawn. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, "I fear this house will never be the same. Beatrice was— she was more than a seamstress to us. She was family." Miss Marple looked up, her eyes kind but searching. "And yet, Lady Eleanor, families have their secrets. I wonder if Beatrice knew something that made her dangerous to someone here." Lady Eleanor's hand trembled as she adjusted her shawl. I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple said nothing more, her needles resuming their quiet dance. The red herrings were multiplying, but she knew the truth lay in the details. The hidden note, the crimson thread, the nervous glances that betrayed the heart. She would watch, and she would listen, and she would unravel the mystery of Thornfield Grange, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The rain had ceased by late afternoon, leaving Thornfield Grange shrouded in a damp, oppressive stillness. The household, confined by Inspector Japp's orders, moved restlessly through the grand rooms, their polite facades fraying like worn fabric. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner of the drawing room, knitted with a calm that contrasted sharply with the tension around her. Her needles clicked softly, a metronome to her thoughts, which were weaving together the scattered threads of Beatrice Lyle's murder. Inspector Japp, his patience thinning, had spent the day chasing Lionel Ashbourne's alibi, convinced that the young man's jealousy and the incriminating letter found in his room pointed to guilt. Yet Miss Marple, with her keen eye for human nature, suspected the truth lay elsewhere, in the subtle inconsistencies that others overlooked. Her mind kept returning to the crimson thread in Beatrice's sewing basket, the hidden note, and the curious absence of struggle in the murder scene. These were not the marks of a crime of passion, but of something colder, more calculated. As the household gathered for tea, an air of forced civility hung over the room. Lady Eleanor poured with a trembling hand, her usual composure strained. Charles and Sylvia sat stiffly, their conversation limited to polite murmurs about the weather. Clara, her eyes still red from crying, avoided looking at her Uncle Lionel, who sat alone, his face a mask of anguish. Dr. Hayworth, attempting to maintain his jovial air, complimented the scones, though his voice lacked its usual warmth. Mrs. Gray, ever watchful, darted glances at each of them, as if hoping to catch a slip of the tongue. Miss Marple, however, was not content to merely observe from her corner. She set her knitting aside and rose, her movements deliberate. "Lady Eleanor," she said gently, "might I trouble you for a moment? I was wondering if I could see the sewing room where Miss Lyle worked. I understand she spent much of her time there." Lady Eleanor looked startled but nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple. It's just off the east wing. I'll show you myself." The sewing room was a small, airy space, its walls lined with shelves of fabric bolts and neatly arranged tools. A large work table dominated the center, scattered with pins, patterns, and a half-finished gown of shimmering silk. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, noting the orderliness that spoke of Beatrice's meticulous nature. A small desk in the corner held a ledger, its pages filled with precise notes on commissions, measurements, and payments. Miss Marple approached the table, her fingers brushing a pair of embroidery scissors, smaller than the murder weapon, but similarly engraved with Beatrice's initials. "She was very particular about her tools, wasn't she?" she mused aloud, her tone conversational. Lady Eleanor nodded, her voice soft. "Beatrice was a perfectionist. She said her scissors were like an extension of her hands. She never let anyone touch them." Miss Marple's gaze settled on a small pin cushion, its surface bristling with needles. One needle, however, caught her attention, a fine silver needle with a tiny bead of crimson thread looped through its eye. It was the same shade as the spool in Beatrice's basket, a vivid hue that seemed out of place among the muted tones of the room. She picked it up carefully, holding it to the light. The thread was knotted at the end, as if it had been used for a single stitch and then abandoned. "Curious?" she said softly, almost to herself. "This thread is identical to the one in her basket, and yet it's not part of any work on this table." Lady Eleanor frowned, peering at the needle. Perhaps she was starting a new project. "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, but her tone suggested doubt. She tucked the needle into her pocket, a small act that felt significant, though she could not yet say why. Her eyes moved to the ledger and she opened it, scanning the entries. Most were routine, orders for gowns, payments from clients like the Duchess of Claremont. But one entry, dated a week ago, stood out. "CA, urgent alteration, no charge." "CA," Miss Marple murmured. "Could that be Charles Ashbourne?" Lady Eleanor hesitated, her hands twisting together. I suppose it could be. Charles did ask Beatrice to mend a coat recently. A tear in the lining, I believe." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. A torn coat was a small matter, but the phrase "no charge" was intriguing. Beatrice, a professional seamstress, was not known for working without payment. Had Charles asked for a favor, or was there something more to this transaction? As they returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion. Inspector Japp stood in the doorway, his face flushed with excitement. "We found something," he announced, holding up a small key, its surface tarnished but distinct. "It was in the garden, near the east wing. Looks like it might fit a lock in Miss Lyle's room." The group gathered closer, their curiosity piqued. Lionel's eyes widened, and he shook his head. "That's not mine," he said quickly. "I've never seen it before." Jap's gaze hardened. "We'll see about that. I'm having the constable check every lock in the house. If this opens something in her room, Mr. Ashbourne, you've got some explaining to do." Miss Marple watched the exchange, her expression serene but her mind alert. The key was another thread, but was it a clue or another red herring? She thought of the crimson needle, the ledger entry, the hidden note. Each was a detail, a stitch in the pattern of Beatrice's death. And then there was Charles's coat. Why had Beatrice mended it for free? Had she found something in the lining, something worth hiding? As Jap continued his interrogation, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles moving with quiet precision. The household was a tapestry of secrets, and she was beginning to see the outline of its design. The key, the thread, the ledger, they were all part of the same fabric, and she would pull at each until the truth unraveled. For now, she would watch and listen, letting her little gray cells work their silent magic. Chapter 7. More Lies Surface. The evening shadows lengthened across Thornfield Grange, casting intricate patterns on the walls of the drawing room where the household gathered, their nerves frayed like the edges of an overworked seam. The discovery of the tarnished key in the garden had sent Inspector Japp into a flurry of activity, and he now stood before the group, his mustache bristling with determination. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her customary corner, knitted with a serene air, her sharp eyes darting from face to face, catching the flickers of unease that betrayed hidden truths. Japp held up the key, its dull surface glinting faintly in the lamplight. "This key," he declared, "fits a small locked box found in Miss Lyle's room. Inside we found a bundle of letters, personal letters, some of them compromising. I'll need to know who wrote them and why they were locked away." A ripple of tension passed through the room. Lionel, still pale from the accusations leveled against him, clenched his fists. "Those letters have nothing to do with her death," he said hoarsely. "Beatrice was private, that's all. She kept her correspondence locked away to protect her clients." "Clients?" Jap's eyes narrowed. "Or someone closer to home. Some of these letters are signed with initials, C.A. and R.H. among them. Care to explain, Mr. Ashbourne?" Charles, who had been standing rigidly by the fireplace, stiffened further. "I wrote no letters to Beatrice," he said sharply. "If my initials are there, it's a coincidence or a forgery." Dr. Hayworth, whose initials matched the other set, coughed awkwardly. "Nor I, Inspector. I admired Beatrice's work, as I've said, but letters? Preposterous." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze settling on the doctor. His denial was too quick, too emphatic, and she noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow. She thought of the ledger entry she had seen in the sewing room, C.A., urgent alteration, no charge, and wondered if the letters might shed light on that curious transaction. But it was Sylvia's reaction that intrigued her most. The woman's hands, usually busy with her wedding ring, were now still, her fingers clenched in her lap, her eyes fixed on her husband with an intensity that spoke of fear, or perhaps betrayal. Lady Eleanor, attempting to maintain order, spoke up. "Inspector, surely these letters are a private matter. Beatrice was a discreet young woman. She would not have kept anything improper." "Discreet or not," Japp replied, "someone killed her, and these letters might tell us why. I'll be sending them to the station for analysis, but I want answers now. Who else had access to her room?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Clara, who had been silent, suddenly spoke, her voice trembling. I went to her room last night around 11. I wanted to talk to her about a dress she was making for me, but she wasn't there. The room was empty. Jap's eyes sharpened. Empty? At 11? You're sure? Clara nodded, her cheeks flushing. I didn't think anything of it. I assumed she was with Lionel or somewhere else in the house. Lionel's head snapped up. She wasn't with me. I told you I was in the gardens. Miss Marple's mind raced, threading together the new information. Clara's visit at 11 placed Beatrice's absence before the estimated time of death, midnight to 2 o'clock. Had she already gone to her secret meeting as the hidden note suggested? And if so, who had she met? The letters, the key, the crimson thread, all were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture remained elusive. Mrs. Gray, sensing an opportunity to stir the pot, leaned forward. I heard something last night, she said, her voice dripping with intrigue. A door closing softly, around midnight. I thought it was the servants, but now I wonder, could it have been someone sneaking to Beatrice's room? Jap scribbled a note, his frustration evident. Right, Mrs. Gray, we'll check the servants' movements. But I'm more interested in these letters. If they're as personal as they seem, someone had a motive to keep them hidden or to silence Beatrice before she could reveal them. As Jap continued his questioning, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the sewing room and the needle with its crimson thread. She had kept it in her pocket, a small but nagging detail. The thread matched the spool in Beatrice's basket, and the note hidden within that spool, "Meet me at midnight, the truth must out," suggested a confrontation. But what truth? And why had Beatrice hidden the note so carefully? She glanced at Sylvia, whose stillness was now almost unnatural. The woman's earlier nervousness had given way to a quiet intensity, as if she were bracing herself for a revelation. Miss Marple recalled the dinner, the way Sylvia's eyes had darted to Charles when Beatrice's name was mentioned. Was there a connection between the letters and the urgent alteration in the ledger? Had Beatrice discovered something in Charles's coat, something worth killing to keep secret? The evening drew on, and Jap's questions grew more pointed, but the answers remained vague, each suspect weaving a web of half-truths. Miss Marple listened, her needles moving slowly, her mind stitching together the fragments. The letters were a significant find, but they were also a distraction, another layer of deception designed to obscure the truth. She thought of Dr. Hayworth's flushed denial, of Charles's rigid composure, of Sylvia's silent dread. Each was hiding something, and the key to Beatrice's murder lay in unraveling their secrets. As the group dispersed for dinner, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes resting on the fireplace where Charles had stood. A small ash mark on the hearth caught her attention, a faint smear, as if something had been burned recently. She knelt, her fingers brushing the mark, and found it still warm to the touch. A scrap of paper, half consumed, lay caught in the grate, its edges singed but a few words still legible. Must not know. Miss Marple's lips pursed, and she tucked the scrap into her pocket alongside the needle. The tapestry of Thornfield Grange was growing more intricate, its threads tangled with lies and half-truths, but she was patient, and she was precise. The truth, she knew, was like a perfect seam, hidden until the right thread was pulled, and she would find that thread, no matter how deeply it was buried. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The atmosphere in Thornfield Grange had grown as taut as a tightly pulled thread, each member of the household moving with the wariness of those who know a storm is brewing. The discovery of the compromising letters and the mysterious key had deepened the suspicion that hung over the estate, and Inspector Japp's relentless questioning had frayed nerves to the breaking point. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her quiet corner of the drawing room, knitted with her usual calm, but her eyes were sharp, catching every glance, every tremor, every unspoken word that passed between the suspects. Dinner had been a somber affair. The clink of silverware and the murmur of forced conversation barely masking the undercurrent of dread. Lionel, still reeling from Jap's accusations, had barely touched his food, his eyes fixed on the empty chair where Beatrice once sat. Sylvia's hands trembled as she lifted her wine glass, her gaze flickering nervously to her husband Charles, who maintained a stoic silence. Clara, pale and withdrawn, excused herself early, claiming fatigue, while Dr. Hayworth's attempts at joviality fell flat, his laughter sounding hollow. Mrs. Gray, ever the opportunist, filled the silences with gossip, but even she seemed subdued, her sharp tongue blunted by the weight of the tragedy. As the group retired to the drawing room for coffee, Miss Marple sensed a shift in the air, a moment when the tightly woven fabric of secrets was about to tear. She had been mulling over the scrap of burned paper she had found in the fireplace. Must not know, and the crimson-threaded needle in her pocket. These clues, combined with the hidden note in Beatrice's sewing basket and the ledger entry about Charles's coat, suggested a web of deceit that centered not on Lionel, but on someone closer to the heart of the Ashbourne family. It was Sylvia who broke first. As Lady Eleanor poured coffee, Sylvia set her cup down with a clatter, her hands shaking violently. "I can't bear it any longer," she said, her voice cracking like thin ice. All eyes turned to her, and she rose, her face pale, her eyes brimming with tears. I I know something about Beatrice's death. I didn't want to say, but I can't keep it inside anymore." The room fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. Inspector Japp, who had been reviewing his notes by the fire, snapped to attention, his notebook at the ready. "Go on, Mrs. Ashbourne," he said, his tone firm but encouraging. "What do you know?" Sylvia's gaze darted to Charles, who sat rigid, his expression unreadable. "It's about the coat," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one Beatrice mended for Charles. I I saw her working on it in the sewing room last week. She was upset, terribly upset. She said she'd found something in the lining, something that shouldn't have been there." Charles's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Sylvia, that's enough," he said sharply, but she shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Charles, I won't be quiet anymore," she cried. "Beatrice told me it was a letter that could ruin someone. She wouldn't say who it was from, but she was frightened. She said she had to decide what to do with it. I begged her to tell me more, but she refused. And now she's dead." The room erupted in murmurs. Lionel's face darkened, and he leaned forward, his voice hoarse. "Why didn't you say this before, Sylvia? If Beatrice was in danger, you should have warned her." "I didn't know it would come to this," Sylvia sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I thought she was being dramatic. I didn't think anyone would kill her." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. The letter Sylvia described matched the one hidden in the crimson spool. "Meet me at midnight. The truth must out." But it also suggested a second letter, one sewn into Charles's coat. Had Beatrice discovered a secret that threatened someone in the household? And had that secret driven the killer to act? Japp, sensing a breakthrough, pressed Sylvia further. "This letter, did she say anything about its contents? A name? A date? Anything?" Sylvia shook her head, her voice trembling. "She only said it was dangerous. She was going to confront someone about it, but she wouldn't tell me who. I I think she was protecting me." Charles rose, his face flushed with anger. "This is nonsense, Inspector. Sylvia's overwrought. Beatrice mended my coat because it was torn, nothing more. There was no letter, no secret. She's mistaken." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, noting the vehemence in Charles's denial. She thought of the ledger entry. C.A. Urgent alteration. No charge. and the burned scrap of paper in the fireplace. Charles's coat was a thread she could not ignore, and Sylvia's outburst had pulled it loose, revealing a glimpse of the truth beneath. Dr. Hayworth, who had been unusually quiet, cleared his throat. "If I may, Inspector, Sylvia's clearly upset. Perhaps she's confused. Beatrice was under a great deal of pressure with her work. It's possible she imagined this letter." Miss Marple's gaze settled on the doctor, her expression serene but probing. "And yet, Dr. Hayworth," she said softly, "you seemed quite interested in Beatrice's work yourself. At dinner, you spoke of secrets and seams. Did you ever see this coat she mended for Mr. Ashbourne?" Hayworth's face reddened, and he stammered, No, I never saw it. I was speaking in jest, as I've said. Beatrice was a friend, nothing more." Japp scribbled furiously, his eyes darting between Sylvia and Charles. "Right. We'll need to find this coat. Mr. Ashbourne, where is it?" Charles's jaw tightened, but he answered evenly. "In my wardrobe, I suppose. I haven't worn it since Beatrice mended it." "Then let's have a look," Japp said, signaling to the constable. As the young officer hurried off, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind weaving together the new information. Sylvia's confession was a turning point, a crack in the carefully stitched facade of Thornfield Grange. The letter in the coat, if it existed, could reveal the motive for Beatrice's murder. But who had written it, and what truth had Beatrice uncovered? As the group waited for the constable's return, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the crimson thread, the needle, the hidden note. Each was a clue, a stitch in a pattern that was slowly taking shape. Sylvia's outburst had exposed a vital thread, but it was not the whole tapestry. Someone in this room was still hiding the truth, and Miss Marple knew that only by pulling the right thread would she unravel the mystery of Beatrice Lyle's death. Chapter 9. The Trap. The air in Thornfield Grange was heavy with anticipation, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The drawing room, lit by the soft glow of lamps, felt smaller, its walls closing in on the gathered household. Inspector Japp stood at the center, his notebook tucked away, his expression one of grim determination. The constable had returned with Charles Ashbourne's coat, a finely tailored garment of dark wool, its lining now the focus of intense scrutiny. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting, watched the scene unfold, her needles moving with a quiet rhythm that belied the sharpness of her observations. Japp held the coat aloft, his fingers probing the lining. "Mrs. Ashbourne," he said, addressing Sylvia, who sat pale and trembling, "you claim Miss Lyle found a letter in this coat. Let's see if there's any truth to that." With a small penknife, he carefully slit the stitching along the inner pocket, revealing a hidden fold. From within, he extracted a folded piece of paper, its edges creased, but intact. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on the letter. Japp unfolded it, his brow furrowing as he read aloud. "My dearest, we cannot continue this way. The risk is too great. Destroy this before it destroys us. It's unsigned, but the handwriting is distinct, and there's a date, 3 weeks ago." Charles's face drained of color, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "That's not mine," he said, his voice tight. "I've never seen it before. Someone must have planted it." Sylvia's eyes widened, and she shook her head, tears welling. "Charles, don't lie. I know about her. Beatrice told me she found it, and I begged her to keep quiet." The room erupted in gasps. Lionel leapt to his feet, his face contorted with anger. "What are you saying, Sylvia? Are you accusing Charles of what? An affair? Murder?" "Enough," Japp barked, holding up a hand. "Mrs. Ashbourne, explain yourself. Who is her?" Sylvia's voice broke as she spoke. "I don't know her name. Beatrice wouldn't tell me. She said she found the letter when she mended the coat, and it suggested Charles was involved with someone. She was going to confront him, to make him tell the truth. Charles's eyes blazed. This is absurd. I've done nothing wrong. That letter could belong to anyone. Beatrice was mistaken, or someone set her up to cause trouble. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady as she observed the chaos. Sylvia's revelation had torn a seam in the household's carefully maintained facade, but she suspected it was not the whole truth. The letter was damning, but its placement in the coat felt too deliberate, too convenient. She thought of the burned scrap in the fireplace. Must not know. And the crimson thread in Beatrice's sewing basket. The pieces were falling into place, but the pattern was still incomplete. Jap, sensing the moment was ripe, decided to press his advantage. "Right," he said, his voice commanding. "I want everyone here now to tell me exactly where you were between midnight and 2 o'clock the night Beatrice died. No more evasions. And I want the truth about your relationships with her. Miss Marple, you've been quiet. Any thoughts?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression serene but her eyes sharp. "Inspector, I believe it is time to gather all the threads of this mystery. If you will permit me, I should like to ask a few questions of my own. Sometimes it is in the asking that the truth reveals itself." Jap, though accustomed to her methods, gave a grudging nod. "Go on then, but make it quick." Miss Marple rose, her small frame commanding the room's attention. "Let us begin with the coat," she said softly. "Mr. Ashbourne, you say you knew nothing of this letter, yet Beatrice mended your coat without charge, an unusual act for a professional seamstress. Why do you suppose she did that?" Charles shifted uncomfortably. "I assumed it was a favor because she was engaged to Lionel. I didn't think it significant." Miss Marple nodded, turning to Dr. Hayworth. "And you, Doctor, spoke of secrets in seams at dinner. A curious remark, was it not? Did you know Beatrice had found something in Mr. Ashbourne's coat?" Hayworth's face reddened, and he cleared his throat. I was joking, as I've said. I had no idea about any letter." Miss Marple's gaze moved to Sylvia. "Mrs. Ashbourne, you said Beatrice was frightened when she found the letter. Did she mention anyone else? Perhaps someone she feared?" Sylvia hesitated, her hands twisting together. She mentioned Dr. Hayworth once. She said he'd been too attentive, always stopping by her shop. She thought he was prying into her work." Hayworth's jaw dropped. "That's outrageous. I was a friend, nothing more. I admired her talent, that's all." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, but she pressed on, turning to Lionel. "Mr. Lionel, you were walking in the gardens at midnight. Did you see anyone near the east wing? Perhaps someone leaving Beatrice's room?" Lionel shook his head, his voice hoarse. "No. It was dark, and the rain was starting. I saw no one." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. She then addressed the group as a whole. "There is a pattern here, my friends, a tapestry of secrets. Beatrice Lyle discovered something that threatened someone in this house. The letter in the coat, the note in the crimson spool, the burned scrap in the fireplace, they all point to a truth someone wished to keep hidden. I suggest we consider not only who had motive, but who had opportunity. The key found in the garden, for instance. Does it belong to anyone here?" The question hung in the air, and Miss Marple watched as the suspects exchanged glances, each one a thread of suspicion. Mrs. Gray, unable to resist, spoke up. "I saw Clara with a key like that once, in the library. She said it was for her diary, but it looked similar." Clara flushed, her voice rising. "That's not true. My diary key is much smaller. I've never seen that key before." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, and she made a mental note of Mrs. Gray's eagerness to point fingers. The trap was set, and the tension in the room was palpable. She knew the killer was among them, watching, listening, perhaps growing careless under the pressure. The letter in the coat was a vital clue, but it was the crimson thread, the needle, the hidden note that held the key to the truth. She would apply just enough pressure to make the guilty party unravel. As Jap took over, demanding to see Clara's diary key, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. The tapestry of Thornfield Grange was fraying, and she was close to finding the loose thread that would bring it all undone. The killer had been clever, but no one could hide from the relentless logic of her little gray cells. Chapter 10: The Reveal. The drawing room at Thornfield Grange was a stage set for revelation, its heavy drapes and flickering lamplight casting long shadows over the gathered household. The tension, which had simmered for days, now boiled over, each suspect a thread stretched to its breaking point. Inspector Japp stood by the fireplace, his notebook discarded, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of closing a case. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner, knitted with a serene air, her needles clicking like the ticking of a clock counting down to the truth. Yet her calm demeanor masked a mind that had meticulously woven together the clues, the crimson thread, the hidden note, the burned scrap, the letter in the coat, into a tapestry that now lay ready to be unveiled. Jap, emboldened by Miss Marple's subtle probing, had called the household together for what he termed a final reckoning. The suspects sat in a semicircle, their faces a gallery of apprehension and defiance. Lady Eleanor, her hands clasped tightly, maintained a fragile dignity. Charles, his jaw set, avoided his wife's gaze. Sylvia, pale and trembling, seemed on the verge of collapse. Lionel, his grief now tinged with anger, stared at the floor. Clara, her youthful innocence strained, clutched her mother's arm. Dr. Hayworth, his jovial mask long gone, fidgeted with his cufflinks, while Mrs. Gray's eyes darted eagerly, as if anticipating a scandal. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her small frame commanding the room's attention. "Inspector," she said softly, her voice cutting through the silence, "you have gathered many threads in this case. The letters, the key, the alibis. But I believe it is time to stitch them together into the truth. May I?" Jap, though accustomed to her methods, gave a grudging nod. "Go ahead, Miss Marple, but I hope you've got more than theories this time." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, but her tone was grave. The murder of Beatrice Lyle was not a crime of passion, as some might believe, but a calculated act to protect a secret. Let us begin with the note hidden in the crimson spool. "Meet me at midnight. The truth must out." This was no lover's tryst, but a summons to confront a dangerous truth. Beatrice, you see, had discovered something that threatened someone in this house. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. The letter in Mr. Charles Ashbourne's coat, found by Beatrice during an urgent alteration, was the key. It read, "My dearest, we cannot continue this way. The risk is too great. Destroy this before it destroys us." Sylvia believed it pointed to an affair, but I suspect it was something far more dangerous. A secret that could ruin not just a reputation, but a family. Charles's face reddened, and he opened his mouth to protest, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "Please, Mr. Ashbourne, let me continue. The ledger in Beatrice's sewing room noted your alteration as no charge, an unusual act for a professional like Beatrice. I believe she found the letter while mending your coat and recognized its significance. She hid it, intending to confront the writer, but she was killed before she could." Miss Marple's eyes moved to Dr. Hayworth, who shifted uncomfortably. "Dr. Hayworth, your remark at dinner about secrets and seams was no jest. You knew Beatrice was meticulous, that she might find something hidden in her work. You visited her shop frequently, did you not? Not out of friendship, but to keep an eye on her, to ensure she did not uncover your secret. Hayworth's face flushed. That's preposterous. I admired her work, nothing more. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, but her words were precise. The letters found in Beatrice's locked box bore your initials, Dr. Hayworth, R.H. They were not love letters, but correspondence with a certain individual, a creditor, perhaps, or someone with knowledge of a past indiscretion. Beatrice found one such letter in Charles's coat, which you had borrowed during a visit to the house. You realized she had it, and when she arranged to meet you at midnight to discuss it, you saw your chance. The room was silent, every eye on Hayworth. He shook his head, his voice rising. This is nonsense. I was in the billiard room that night, as I said. Miss Marple's gaze was unrelenting. The billiard room is near the east wing, close enough to slip into Beatrice's room unnoticed. The key found in the garden was yours, was it not? It opened the box where you kept your compromising letters, but you dropped it in your haste to leave the scene. And the crimson thread, Doctor, that was your mistake. You used Beatrice's scissors to kill her, a deliberate choice to make it seem a crime of passion. But you did not notice the needle with the crimson thread, which Beatrice had been holding when you entered. It fell to the floor, a silent witness to your act. Sylvia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. You mean Dr. Hayworth killed her? But why? Miss Marple turned to her, her expression kind but firm. The letter in the coat was not about an affair, Mrs. Ashbourne, but about a financial scandal. Dr. Hayworth had been embezzling funds from his practice, using Charles's legal connections to cover his tracks. The letter was from a creditor demanding payment, and Beatrice, in her meticulous way, recognized the names involved. She intended to expose him, not to ruin him, but to protect the family she loved. Hayworth leapt to his feet, his face contorted. You have no proof. This is all conjecture. Miss Marple's voice remained steady. The burned scrap in the fireplace, must not know, was part of another letter you tried to destroy, Doctor. But you could not destroy the truth. Beatrice's ledger, her sewing basket, the needle with the crimson thread, they all point to you, and your alibi, so carefully constructed, falls apart when we consider the timing. Clara saw Beatrice's room empty at 11, but you were in the billiard room until 1. You had ample time to slip into her room, kill her, and return before anyone noticed. Jap, his eyes wide, stepped forward. Is this true, Hayworth? Did you kill her? Hayworth's shoulders slumped, and he sank back into his chair, his face ashen. I didn't mean to, he whispered. She was going to ruin me. I begged her to stay quiet, but she wouldn't listen. I panicked. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs, but Miss Marple remained calm, her work complete. Jap signaled to the constable, who moved to restrain Hayworth. As the doctor was led away, his confession a final unraveling thread, the household sat in stunned silence. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles resuming their quiet dance. The truth, she said softly, almost to herself, is like a perfect seam. It holds only when every stitch is true. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The morning after Dr. Hayworth's confession dawned clear and bright over Thornfield Grange, the sunlight streaming through the windows as if to cleanse the house of its dark secrets. The oppressive weight that had hung over the estate seemed to lift, though a quiet melancholy lingered in its place. The household gathered in the drawing room, their faces a mixture of relief and sorrow, as they processed the revelation that had unraveled the mystery of Beatrice Lyle's death. Inspector Jap, his notebook now closed, stood by the door, preparing to depart with the constable and the handcuffed Dr. Hayworth. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar corner, knitted with her usual calm, her needles clicking softly, a gentle counterpoint to the subdued murmurs around her. Lady Eleanor, her composure restored, but her eyes weary, approached Miss Marple, her hands clasped tightly. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low but heartfelt, "I cannot thank you enough. Without your insight, we might never have known the truth. Poor Beatrice. She deserved better." Miss Marple looked up, her eyes kind but piercing. "The truth, Lady Eleanor, is often a painful thing, but it is always better known. Beatrice was a woman of integrity, and it was that integrity that made her dangerous to Dr. Hayworth. She could not stay silent when she uncovered his deceit." Lionel, his grief now tempered by understanding, sat nearby, his hands clasped tightly. "I should have protected her," he said hoarsely. "If I'd known what she was facing, I could have stopped it." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she regarded him with gentle sympathy. "You must not blame yourself, Mr. Lionel. Beatrice's strength was in her silence, her determination to do what was right. She kept her discovery hidden to protect you all, but it was a burden too heavy for one person to bear." Sylvia, still shaken by her own role in revealing the truth, sat beside Charles, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since the confrontation. "I should have spoken sooner," Sylvia said, her voice trembling. "If I'd told someone about the letter, perhaps she'd still be alive." Charles reached for her hand, his expression softening for the first time in days. "You did what you thought was right, Sylvia. We all made mistakes. I should have been more open with you." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Secrets, my dear Mrs. Ashbourne, are like poorly stitched seams. They hold for a time, but they always come undone. Dr. Hayworth's secret was his undoing, but it was Beatrice's courage that brought it to light. She found the letter in Mr. Charles's coat, a letter that revealed the doctor's embezzlement, and she knew it could ruin him. Her decision to confront him was not out of malice, but out of a desire to protect this family." Clara, who had been listening silently, spoke up, her voice small but clear. "Miss Marple, how did you know it was Dr. Hayworth? There were so many clues, so many lies." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, and she set her knitting in her lap. "It is the little things, Miss Clara, that tell the story. The crimson thread in Beatrice's sewing basket was no ordinary thread. It was a marker, a sign of her discovery. The note hidden in the spool, the needle on the floor, the burned scrap in the fireplace. These were the threads of her final act. Dr. Hayworth's remark about secrets and seams was not a jest, but a slip, a hint that he knew Beatrice was close to the truth. His alibi, so carefully placed in the billiard room, was too convenient, and the key in the garden was his mistake. It all formed a pattern, you see, and once I saw it, the truth could not be hidden." Inspector Japp, who had been listening from the doorway, cleared his throat. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said, a grudging admiration in his voice. "I was ready to pin it on young Lionel, but you saw through the red herrings. I'll be sure to mention your help in my report." Miss Marple smiled faintly, shaking her head. "I require no credit, Inspector. I'm only glad that justice has been served. Beatrice Lyle was a woman of skill and heart, and her loss is a great one. But the truth, however painful, restores order." As Japp and the constable escorted Dr. Hayworth to the waiting motor car, the household began to disperse, each member retreating to process the events in their own way. Lady Eleanor invited Miss Marple to stay another day, but she declined politely, citing a need to return to St. Mary Mead. "There are always matters to attend to at home," she said, though her true reason was a desire to leave the family to heal in private. As she packed her small suitcase, Miss Marple reflected on the case. It had been a tapestry of human frailty, greed, fear, love, and betrayal, all woven together in the quiet elegance of Thornfield Grange. She thought of Beatrice, whose meticulous stitches had hidden a dangerous truth, and of Dr. Hayworth, whose desperation had led to a fatal act. The crimson thread, the hidden note, the letter in the coat, they were all part of a larger pattern, one that only her little gray cells could discern. With her knitting bag tucked under her arm, Miss Marple descended the grand staircase one final time, her steps light but purposeful. The house was quiet now, its secrets laid bare. As she stepped into the waiting car that would take her to the station, she cast a final glance at Thornfield Grange, its ivy-clad walls glowing in the morning sun. Order, she murmured to herself, is a delicate thing, but it can always be restored. And with that, she was gone, leaving behind a house forever changed, but a truth forever. Chapter 12. The Unraveled Thread. The quiet of Thornfield Grange, so recently restored by the revelation of Dr. Hayworth's guilt, was disrupted once more as the household gathered for lunch, their faces marked by a fragile hope of moving forward. The sun streamed through the dining room windows, casting a warm glow over the polished table, but the air remained heavy with the aftershocks of Beatrice Lyle's murder. Miss Jane Marple, who had intended to depart that morning, had been persuaded by Lady Eleanor to stay for one final meal, a gesture of gratitude for her role in uncovering the truth. As she sat at the table, her knitting bag at her side, her sharp eyes noticed a lingering unease, a thread that had not yet been fully pulled. The meal was a subdued affair, with conversation limited to polite inquiries about the weather and the upcoming village fete. Lionel, though still pale, seemed to draw strength from the resolution of the case, his grief tempered by the knowledge that Beatrice's killer had been brought to justice. Sylvia and Charles, seated side by side, exchanged tentative glances, their strained marriage showing signs of mending. Clara, her youthful spirit slowly returning, spoke softly of a memorial for Beatrice, a suggestion that Lady Eleanor received with a nod of approval. Mrs. Gray, however, was uncharacteristically quiet, her usual gossip replaced by a thoughtful silence that Miss Marple found intriguing. As the dessert course was served, a delicate fruit tart, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small detail that had nagged at her since the previous evening. The burned scrap of paper she had found in the fireplace. Must not know. Had been a crucial clue, but its context remained unclear. Why had Dr. Hayworth burned it, and why had it been only partially destroyed, as if the act had been interrupted? Her mind returned to the crimson thread, the needle, the hidden note in the spool. These were the stitches of Beatrice's final act, but there was one more thread she sensed that had yet to be unraveled. Lady Eleanor, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but clear, I wonder if I might ask about the fireplace in the drawing room. It was cleaned recently, was it not? Yet I found a scrap of paper there, partially burned. It seemed out of place. Lady Eleanor's hand paused over her teacup, her expression one of mild surprise. The fireplace? I believe the servants cleaned it the day before before the tragedy, but I can't imagine why anything would be left behind. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to Mrs. Gray, who had stiffened slightly at the mention of the fireplace. Mrs. Gray, she continued, her tone conversational, you mentioned hearing a door creak around midnight on the night of the murder. You thought it was the house settling, but could it have been someone moving through the drawing room, perhaps tending to the fire? Mrs. Gray's eyes widened, and she set her spoon down with a clatter. I'm not sure, Miss Marple, she said, her voice faltering. It was late, and I was half asleep. I could have been mistaken. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, and she leaned forward, her gaze steady. But you are not often mistaken, Mrs. Gray. You have a keen ear for the goings-on in this house. I wonder if you saw something that night, someone perhaps who was not where they claimed to be. The room fell silent, every eye on Mrs. Gray. She flushed, her hands twisting in her lap. I don't know what you mean, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I was in my room, as I told the inspector. Miss Marple's needles, which she had resumed knitting, clicked softly. Of course, she said, her tone deceptively mild. But the burned scrap in the fireplace troubles me. It suggests someone was trying to destroy evidence, and Dr. Hayworth, though guilty of murder, was not the only one with secrets. I wonder, Mrs. Gray, if you know more about that letter than you've let on. The accusation, delivered with such gentle precision, sent a ripple of shock through the room. Lionel's head snapped up, and Sylvia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Charles's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, his gaze fixed on Mrs. Gray. Lady Eleanor, her composure wavering, leaned forward. Miss Marple, what are you suggesting? Miss Marple's eyes remained on Mrs. Gray, who was now visibly trembling. Mrs. Gray, you have been most attentive to the affairs of this house. You knew of Beatrice's discovery, didn't you? Not the letter in the coat, but another letter, one that implicated you in a matter you wished to keep hidden. The burned scrap was part of a letter you wrote, was it not? A letter that Beatrice found, perhaps in her sewing basket among her other papers. Mrs. Gray's face drained of color, and she shook her head frantically. No, that's not true. I had nothing to do with her death. Miss Marple's voice was calm but relentless. I believe you, Mrs. Gray, when you say you did not kill Beatrice. But you knew of Dr. Hayworth's embezzlement, didn't you? You had been corresponding with him, perhaps blackmailing him, and Beatrice found your letter. You burned it in the fireplace, but in your haste, you left a fragment behind. That fragment, must not know, was a warning to Dr. Hayworth, a warning that drove him to act. The room was stunned into silence. Mrs. Gray's hands clutched the arms of her chair, her eyes wide with panic. I only wanted to protect myself, she stammered. I knew about his dealings, yes, but I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. I wrote to him, yes, to ask for a share, but I didn't know he'd kill her. Lady Eleanor's voice was sharp with betrayal. Lavinia, how could you? You brought this darkness into our home. Miss Marple raised a hand, her expression kind but firm. Mrs. Gray's actions were selfish, but they were not murderous. Dr. Hayworth's desperation was his own, and it was he who chose to silence Beatrice. But Mrs. Gray, you must tell Inspector Japp everything. The truth, however painful, must be fully known. Mrs. Gray broke down, her sobs echoing through the room as she confessed to her blackmail attempt. Inspector Japp, who had been summoned by a servant, listened grimly, his notebook once again open. As he took Mrs. Gray's statement, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind at peace. The final thread had been pulled, revealing the full pattern of deceit that had led to Beatrice's death. As the meal concluded, Miss Marple prepared to leave, her work at Thornfield Grange complete. The household, though shaken, was beginning to heal, and she knew they would find their way forward. The truth, she reflected, was like a needle, sharp, precise, and capable of mending even the most tangled fabric. Chapter 13. The Tangled Motives. The afternoon sun cast a golden hue over Thornfield Grange, softening the edges of a house that had borne witness to betrayal and loss. The revelation of Mrs. Gray's blackmail attempt had sent ripples through the household, each member grappling with the knowledge that their quiet lives had been woven with threads of deceit. Miss Jane Marple, preparing to depart for St. Mary Mead, lingered in the drawing room, her knitting bag packed, but her mind still threading through the final intricacies of the case. Though Dr. Hayworth's guilt was certain and Mrs. Gray's complicity exposed, a faint unease persisted, like a stitch missed in a complex pattern. Inspector Japp, now joined by a second constable to escort Mrs. Gray for further questioning, was tying up loose ends, his brusque efficiency a contrast to Miss Marple's quiet deliberation. The household gathered one last time, their faces a mix of relief and lingering shock. Lady Eleanor, her dignity strained but intact, sat at the head of the room, her hands folded tightly. Charles and Sylvia, their marriage tested by secrets, sat close together, their hands touching in a tentative gesture of reconciliation. Lionel, his grief now mingled with a quiet resolve, stood by the window, staring out at the gardens where he had walked on the night of Beatrice's death. Clara, her youthful spirit subdued, hovered near her mother, while Mrs. Gray, now pale and silent, awaited her fate under Jap's watchful eye. Miss Marple, her knitting needle still for the moment, addressed the group with her characteristic gentleness. "My friends," she said, her voice soft but clear, "the truth about Beatrice Lyle's death has been revealed, but I sense there is one final thread to be examined. It is not enough to know who acted and why. We must understand the motives that wove this tragedy together." Jap, pausing in his preparations, raised an eyebrow. "Miss Marple, you've already solved the case. Hayworth's confessed, and Mrs. Gray's admitted her part. What more is there?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, but her expression was grave. "There is always more to human nature, Inspector. Mrs. Gray's blackmail was a catalyst, but I wonder if there was another motive, another secret, that pushed Dr. Hayworth to such a desperate act. I have been thinking about the ledger in Beatrice's sewing room, the entry for C.A., urgent alteration, no charge. It was not just a favor, I believe, but a clue to a deeper connection." Charles stiffened, his hand tightening around Sylvia's. "I've told you, Miss Marple, it was just a torn coat. Beatrice mended it as a kindness, nothing more." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze steady. "And yet, Mr. Ashbourne, the letter found in your coat was not addressed to you, but to Dr. Hayworth. It was a creditor's demand, hidden in the lining, perhaps by mistake. But I wonder if Beatrice's discovery was not the only threat to Dr. Hayworth. I wonder if there was another secret, one that touched this family more closely." Sylvia's breath caught, and she looked at Miss Marple with wide eyes. "What are you suggesting? That there was more to Beatrice's death than we know?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but probing. "Mrs. Ashbourne, you said Beatrice was frightened when she found the letter, but you also mentioned she spoke of Dr. Hayworth's attentiveness, his frequent visits to her shop. I believe she uncovered not only his embezzlement, but something else, something that linked him to this household in a way we have not yet fully understood." Lionel turned from the window, his face pale. "What could that be? Beatrice never mentioned anything to me about Hayworth, except that he was a nuisance." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Lady Eleanor, who had grown very still. "Lady Eleanor," she said softly, "you invited me to Thornfield Grange, and your letter hinted at unease. I wonder if you knew, or suspected, something about Dr. Hayworth's dealings with your family. Perhaps a financial arrangement or a secret that Beatrice stumbled upon." Lady Eleanor's hands trembled, and she looked away, her voice barely audible. I had my suspicions. Dr. Hayworth was our physician for years, but he was also a friend, or so I thought. There were rumors in the village about his finances, whispers of debts. I asked Beatrice to keep an eye on him, to let me know if she heard anything unusual. I never imagined it would lead to this." Miss Marple nodded, her mind piecing together the final threads. Beatrice, in her meticulous way, did more than mend clothes. She listened, she observed, and she discovered Dr. Hayworth's secret, not just his embezzlement, but his attempt to manipulate this family's trust. The letter in the coat was meant for him, but it was Mrs. Gray's blackmail that pushed him to act. She knew of his debts and threatened to expose him unless he paid her. Beatrice, caught in the middle, became a danger to both. Mrs. Gray, her face ashen, shook her head.
I guess I only wanted security," she whispered. "I didn't know he'd kill her." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her words were firm. Your actions, Mrs. Gray, set a chain in motion, but Dr. Hayworth's choice was his own. He killed Beatrice to silence her, but he could not silence the truth. The crimson thread, the hidden note, the burned scrap, they were all signs of her determination to do what was right. Jap, listening intently, scratched his head. So, you're saying Hayworth's motive wasn't just the embezzlement, but fear of losing the Ashbournes' trust? Precisely, Miss Marple said. He had built a life on their patronage, their respect. Beatrice's discovery threatened to unravel it all, and Mrs. Gray's blackmail was the final push, making him believe he had no choice but to act. The room fell silent, the weight of the truth settling over them. Lady Eleanor rose, her voice steady despite her pallor. Miss Marple, you have given us clarity, though it is a bitter gift. We will honor Beatrice's memory, and we will rebuild. Miss Marple inclined her head, her work complete. As she gathered her things to leave, she reflected on the tangled motives that had led to such tragedy. Greed, fear, and misplaced trust had woven a deadly pattern, but it was Beatrice's courage that had brought it to light. With a final glance at the household, Miss Marple stepped into the waiting car, her knitting bag at her side, ready to return to the quiet order of St. Mary Mead.
Chapter 14. The Final Stitches. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Thornfield Grange, casting a gentle glow over the drawing room where the household had gathered once more. The air was softer now, the oppressive tension of the past days giving way to a somber acceptance. The truth about Beatrice Lyle's murder had been laid bare, with Dr. Hayworth's confession and Mrs. Gray's complicity unraveling the dark tapestry that had enveloped the estate. Yet as Miss Jane Marple prepared to take her leave, her sharp eyes detected a final, delicate thread that needed to be secured to complete the pattern. The household sat in a loose circle, their faces reflecting a mix of relief and lingering sorrow. Lady Eleanor, her dignity restored but her eyes shadowed, sipped her tea with a steady hand. Charles and Sylvia, their bond strengthened by the ordeal, exchanged quiet words, their earlier strain replaced by a tentative warmth. Lionel, though still haunted by grief, had found a measure of peace in knowing Beatrice's killer had been brought to justice. Clara, her youthful spirit flickering back to life, spoke of plans for a memorial garden in Beatrice's honor. Mrs. Gray, now under the watchful eye of Inspector Japp's constable, sat apart, her usual vivacity replaced by a subdued resignation. Miss Marple, her knitting bag packed and resting at her feet, addressed the group with her characteristic gentleness. "My dear friends," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of authority, "the tragedy of Beatrice Lyle's death has been resolved, but I feel there is one final matter to address. It is not enough to know who committed the crime. We must understand the full weave of the human heart that led to such an act." Inspector Japp, preparing to depart with Mrs. Gray for further questioning at the station, paused at the door, his mustache twitching with curiosity. "Miss Marple, you've already worked miracles here. What's left to say?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, but her expression was earnest. "There is always one last stitch, Inspector, to ensure the fabric holds. I have been thinking about Beatrice's sewing basket, the crimson thread, and the note hidden within it. These were not merely clues to her murder, but a testament to her character. She was a woman who saw the world in details, and it was a detail that cost her her life." She turned to Clara, who looked up with wide, curious eyes. "Miss Clara, you mentioned visiting Beatrice's room at 11 on the night of her death, finding it empty. I wonder if you noticed anything unusual, perhaps something in her sewing basket or on her table." Clara frowned, her brow furrowing in thought. I don't think so, Miss Marple. I was only there for a moment, but now that you mention it, I did see her sewing basket open, and there was a small notebook inside, not her usual ledger. I thought it was for her designs, but I didn't look closely." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. A notebook, you say? That is most interesting. I wonder if we might find it, Lady Eleanor. It could shed light on Beatrice's final thoughts. Lady Eleanor, ever the gracious hostess, rose at once. Of course, Miss Marple. I'll have the servants fetch it from her room. Within minutes, a maid returned with a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with Beatrice's precise handwriting. Miss Marple opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the entries. Most were sketches of dress designs, notes on fabrics, and measurements for clients. But toward the end, a single page stood out, written in a hurried hand. RH owes thousands. Letters to CA confirm it. Must speak to Lady E before it's too late. The room fell silent as Miss Marple read the entry aloud. Lady Eleanor's hand flew to her throat, and she sank back into her chair. Beatrice knew, she whispered. She was going to tell me about Dr. Hayworth's debts. I should have acted on my suspicions sooner. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. You could not have known, Lady Eleanor. Beatrice was protecting you, as she protected everyone she cared for. This notebook confirms what we suspected. Dr. Hayworth's embezzlement was the heart of the matter, and Mrs. Gray's blackmail was the spark. But there is one more detail that troubles me. She turned to Mrs. Gray, who sat hunched, her eyes downcast. Mrs. Gray, you admitted to blackmailing Dr. Hayworth, but I wonder if you also knew of Beatrice's notebook. Did you see her writing in it, perhaps during one of your visits to her shop? Did you suspect she was documenting Dr. Hayworth's secrets? Mrs. Gray's head snapped up, her face pale. I saw her writing once, yes, but I didn't know what it was. I thought it was just her designs. I swear, I didn't know she was writing about him. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her voice calm but piercing. I believe you, Mrs. Gray, but your actions set a chain in motion. Beatrice's notebook was her final act of loyalty to this family, and it was that loyalty that made her a target. Dr. Hayworth, fearing exposure, acted in desperation, but it was your pressure that pushed him to the edge. Jap, his notebook open once more, scribbled furiously. This notebook's going to the station, he said. It's evidence, and it ties everything together. Miss Marple, you've outdone yourself. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression modest. I only follow the threads, Inspector. Beatrice's notebook, the crimson thread, the hidden note, they were all part of her attempt to do right. It is a sad truth that doing right can sometimes lead to such tragedy. As the household absorbed this final revelation, Miss Marple rose, her departure imminent. She looked at each of them. Lady Eleanor, Charles, Sylvia, Lionel, Clara, seeing not just their pain, but their resilience. Thornfield Grange will heal, she said softly. Beatrice's memory will live on in the goodness you do for one another. With her knitting bag in hand, Miss Marple made her way to the door, her steps light but purposeful. The tapestry of Thornfield Grange was complete, its final stitches sewn with care. As she stepped into the waiting car, she cast a last glance at the house, its ivy-clad walls standing firm against the trials they had endured. The truth had been a sharp needle, but it had mended the fabric of justice, and that, she knew, was enough. Chapter 15. The Tapestry. Restored. The sun was dipping below the horizon as Miss Jane Marple's car rolled away from Thornfield Grange, the golden light bathing the estate in a serene glow that seemed to promise renewal. Inside the house, the household had dispersed after the final revelations, each member retreating to reflect on the truths uncovered and the wounds left behind by Beatrice Lyle's murder. The air, once thick with suspicion and dread, now carried a fragile hope, as if the unraveling of the mystery had allowed the first threads of healing to be woven. Miss Marple, seated in the back of the car, her knitting bag nestled beside her, gazed out at the passing countryside, her mind still threading through the events of the past days. The case had been a complex tapestry, woven with greed, fear, and loyalty, and it had taken all her little gray cells to discern its pattern. Dr. Hayworth's confession, Mrs. Gray's blackmail, and Beatrice's notebook had formed the final stitches, but it was the human heart, its frailties and strengths, that had shaped the tragedy. As the car wound through the lanes of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the small details that had led to the truth. The crimson thread in Beatrice's sewing basket, so vivid against the muted hues, had been more than a clue. It was a symbol of Beatrice's courage, her determination to stitch together the truth even at great personal cost. The hidden note, "Meet me at midnight, the truth must out," had been her final act of defiance against the secrets that threatened the Ashbourne family. And the burned scrap in the fireplace, with its cryptic warning, "Must not know," had revealed the desperation that drove Dr. Hayworth to murder. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the household she had left behind. Lady Eleanor, whose quiet strength had held the family together, would guide them through their grief. Charles and Sylvia, their marriage tested by suspicion, had found a path to reconciliation, their hands clasped in a silent vow to rebuild trust. Lionel, heartbroken but resolute, would honor Beatrice's memory in his own way, perhaps through the memorial garden Clara had proposed. And Clara herself, so young yet so perceptive, would carry forward the lessons of truth and justice. As for Mrs. Gray, her fate lay in the hands of Inspector Japp and the courts. Her blackmail had set the wheels of tragedy in motion, but Miss Marple felt a pang of pity for her. A woman driven by greed, yes, but also by the fear of insignificance in a world that valued wealth and status. Dr. Hayworth, the true villain, had allowed his desperation to corrupt his duty as a physician, betraying the trust of those who relied on him. His punishment, Miss Marple knew, would be both legal and moral, a life unraveled by his own actions. The car slowed as it approached her modest cottage in St. Mary Mead, its rose-covered walls a welcome sight after the grandeur and turmoil of Thornfield Grange. Miss Marple stepped out, thanking the driver with a polite nod, and made her way to the door, her knitting bag in hand. Inside, the familiar comforts of her home awaited, her armchair, her teapot, her garden, but her mind lingered on the case. She settled into her chair, her needles resuming their quiet dance as she began a new project, a scarf in soft gray wool. The rhythm of her knitting was soothing, a counterpoint to the complexity of human nature she had just witnessed. "People are like tapestries," she murmured to herself, "each thread a choice, a secret, a moment of truth or deceit. It is the small stitches, the ones we overlook, that tell the story." Miss Marple thought of Beatrice, whose skill with a needle had been matched by her integrity, and of the crimson thread that had marked her final stand. She thought of the Ashbournes, whose lives would forever bear the mark of this tragedy, but who would find strength in their shared loss. And she thought of herself, a quiet observer whose little gray cells had mended the torn fabric of justice. As the evening deepened and the stars began to appear, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and poured a cup of tea. The case of Thornfield Grange was closed, its secrets laid bare, its tapestry restored. She took a sip, her eyes resting on the garden outside where the roses nodded in the gentle breeze. "Order," she said softly, "is a delicate thing, but it can always be stitched anew." And with that, she turned her thoughts to the quiet days ahead, knowing that another mystery, another tapestry, would surely find its way to her door.